Okay, let me introduce myself. My name is Lyudmila Bolsunovskaya. I am Associate Professor, Tomsk Polytechnic University, Russia. And it's my pleasure to be the chair of this session. And I want to wish you all very fruitful and interesting conference. And could you remind you all the tips, paper presentations, as you saw, time is up 20 minutes and 10 minutes to follow for questions and answers. And you may also ask us questions and give comments through our chat. And let me introduce the first paper presentation. Dominicans be like ethno-rationalistic stance taken and the construction of Dominicadat in the US. Iris Clemens, University of Texas at Austin. And the second presentation will be genre as a double-edged sword in language for specific purposes, variability and standardization in cooperative agreement. Authors Mary C. Levissier, University of Nantes, and Lauren Fedi, Isabel Richard, University of Nantes, and Alexandra Levissier. Thank you again, and let's start with our first presentation, please, with Iris, yes?
Okay, share. I'm hoping that everybody can see the presentation. So yes, good afternoon or evening from wherever you may be signing in from. I'd like to take a moment to recognize that wherever we may be signing in from, at least in North America, that we're meeting on occupied indigenous territories of Turtle Island. And as such, I recognize a continued need of engaging decolonial scholarship, and that's what I plan to do today. So my name is Iris Clemens, and I'm a fifth-year doctoral candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin. And today my talk, entitled Dominicans Be Like, Ethno-Racial Linguistic Stance Taking and the Construction of Dominicanidad in the United States, focuses on the ways that notions of Blackness are talked about, acquired, and contested across ethnic groups who engage in social media discourse. But before moving into the presentation, I'm going to give a brief introduction of who I am, because I think it's important to be transparent about where I come from in terms of how I came to this research, because I think it situates how I have my research frames, my questions, and ultimately my interpretations. So my father's African American and my mother was born in Martinique, West Indian island. And so I was raised around this unique Black diaspora consisting of African Americans, West Indians, and recent African migrants. At the same time, I grew up watching my grandmother and her activist colleagues defend the rights of Black English and what would lead up to the Oakland Ebonics debates of the 1990s. So I was raised around these coalitions that really gave me a passion in Black liberatory struggles and linguistic diversity, and especially Black linguistic diversity. So at 19, when I moved to Spain, I was immediately re-ethnicized as a Dominican. And I began to notice cultural similarities between Dominicans and my West Indian Caribbean family back in California. But at the same time, I noticed a rhetorical separation. So Dominicans were Latinos or Latinas and not West Indians, and many times not even Caribbean. And because I grew up in this enclave where heritage from any West Indian island made you automatic family, I began to question this separation between what amounted to be Anglo, Dutch, and French Caribbean from the Spanish Caribbean. So this question has driven much of my research. And now that I'm armed with a lot more historical knowledge, my aim is to demystify this separation. So in the current study, I'm going to explore several moments of discursive conflicts and solidarities, and the role that language plays in mapping the margins of ethno-racial categorization and identity for Dominican Americans in the United States. So these conflicts often play out in the public sphere, and we see in this following example how that is. So on Tuesday, June 25th in 2019, so long ago, Belcalis Almenzar, better known as Cardi B, took to Instagram Live in order to defend her Blackness. So her aim was to clarify confusion about her ethno-racial identity, following a wave of criticism resulting from her Black Entertainment Television Album of the Word a Year and her Best Female Hip Hop Artist Awards. So people argued that she should not be eligible for the awards because she is, quote, not Black, end quote. They maintained that her use of Spanish language and her previous claims of Latinidad precluded her from this Blackness. And the policing of Blackness is not new. However, increased migrations from Latin America and the Caribbean have complicated and enriched the racial landscapes of the United States. So Cardi B, in her response, attempted to dispel the myth of a mutual exclusivity between Latinidad and Blackness. And she says, quote, "People don't be understanding. It's like Cardi's Latin, she's not Black. And it's like, bro, my features do not come from white people effing, okay? But because Cardi speaks Spanish to people, she's not Black, even though we have similar features, same skin complexion. But no, they don't want to put Cardi in it because I speak Spanish," end quote. She then goes on to explain that the fundamental problem is a misunderstanding of the differences between race, ethnicity, and nationality. So several videos popped up in response to this situation, and they weighed in on the debate of whether Cardi B could authentically claim her Blackness. So topics such as color, physical features, including hair texture and nose size, familial ancestry, neighborhood, and former enslavement in the United States all entered the conversation. But what was clear from the responses is that there was a wide range of opinions from Dominicans and non-Dominicans alike about what it means to be Black in the United States. And furthermore, that these notions of what Dominicanidad is, what it means to be Dominican, are being shaped by what it means to be Black in this country. So in order to contend with this question, I think it's first important to recognize the commonalities and differences between race construction across the Americas. In the United States, we've generally functioned for the history of the country, basically, on a Black and white dichotomy, which is characterized by what's popularly known as the one drop rule of hypodescent. So that means if anybody has one drop of African ancestry, then they're cast into the racial category of Black. And that creates like a Black-white binary, or at least a white non-white binary. On the other hand, in the Dominican Republic and in much of Latin America, one drop of European blood casts you out of the categorization of Black and into a categorization of mixed, which creates this kind of tripartite conceptualization of race in which the labels Black, white, and mixed can coexist. So I'm investigating public stances towards the category Black, or Black as an identity category for Dominican Americans, because they're a group with a representative population that would be marked and identified as Black in the United States, despite possibly holding racial linguistic ideologies or explicit pronouncements to the contrary. So I formulate my investigation under two guiding questions. First, what linguistic ideologies are implicated in the construction of Blackness for Dominicans and Dominican Americans? And second, how is Dominicanidad, and thus Blackness and Latinidad, taken up in the larger public? So how are we thinking about Blackness in response to all of these questions? So I'm going to take a minute to delve into the novel theoretical frame that I constructed in order to make these claims about the formation of Dominicanidad and Blackness in the United States. It's based on concepts from linguistic anthropology, sociolinguistics, and critical Black studies. So the frame incorporates racial-linguistic ideologies from Rosa and Flores, which posits an inextricable linkage between our ideas about race and our ideas about language, and vice versa. It also takes up linguistic stance-taking behavior, which is the ability to make language choices and use linguistic forms that index particular named social categories. And lastly, it expands on the concept, on Rosa and Flores' concept of racial-linguistic enregisterment, which refers to a process whereby distinct linguistic forms become racialized, to incorporate the idea of ideological enregisterment. And so ideological enregisterment notes that the process of acquiring and forming ideologies is also systematically enregistered through discourse and in discourse. So through this approach, I use a critical discourse analysis first to examine the existence of 4 racial-linguistic ideologies that have already been defined in previous literature. I then use a critical conversation analysis to examine the stances that folks are taking towards or against these ideologies. And then finally, I examine the affective dimensions of these stances in order to draw conclusions about the boundaries of ethno-racial differences amongst people who would be marked as Black in the United States. So I'm going to quickly review the procedures, and then in the interest of time, I'm going to just present the results from the stance dimension, the affective dimension analysis. So after selecting and transcribing 10 YouTube videos related to Dominicanness and Blackness, I took a phenomenological approach applying 4 racial linguistic codes, which I'm going to explain in a second. Videos were produced by Dominicans and other Black diaspora content producers, including Nigerian Americans, Cuban Americans, and Panamanian Americans. And so the 4 ideologies investigated were first the DNA ideology, and this posits race as a biological and scientific construct that can be accounted for by a percentage of DNA and heritage linked to a particular landmass. The categorization fallacy or the category fallacy, which is the conflation of ethnicity, nationality, and race, or the notions of these things that is identifiable by one particular pan-ethnic term, such as when we use Black, the racial term, to only indicate African Americans. Also, I changed the co-naturalization of language and race, which is the conflation of language and race as a named category of belonging. So this is adapted from Rosanne Flores' notions of co-naturalization of language and race. And an example of this would be in New York, when we say Spanish people, we mean anybody who speaks Spanish, regardless of what country they're actually from. And lastly, I look at accent ideology, which is racial belonging based on the ability to produce unaccented language. So in this case, for Latinos as a pan-racial or an ethnic, ethno-racial term, unaccented Spanish, and then for English for Black Americans or Black people. Right? I also called the top 5 comment threads with between 10 and 50 comments for each video for a total of 807 comments, which yielded 659 examples of this target racial linguistic ideologies. And for each of them, I gave them a score between 1 and 5 for 3 stance dimensions or measures: affect, alignment, and investment. So lower scores tended towards negative or lack of engagement with the racial linguistic ideologies, and higher scores indicate more positive and full engagement. So these measures were defined as follows in order to create the coding scheme. So first, affect was marked for any time an interlocutor had a positive or negative evaluation. So if they had positive, then they were towards 5. If they had negative, then it was towards a 1. Investment was evidenced through an interlocutor's recognition and perceived willingness to take part in a discussion about an ideology. So if they took part in it and they were willing to take part in it, they got a 5. If they didn't, then they got a 1 or a 0. And then lastly, alignment refers to an interlocutor's agreement or alignment with the racial linguistic ideology. And so alignment ranged from explicit agreement to outright objection. And in the following slides, I'll give a very quick overview of how the ideologies appeared across the data set. And then I'm going to present this conversation analysis of these affective stances. Okay, so how did the ideologies manifest across the entire data set? So with videos and comments, there were a total of 933 excerpts, which yielded 925 instances of these focal racial linguistic ideologies. The DNA ideology was the most prevalent with 535 appearances, and this was closely followed by the categorization fallacy with 372 appearances. So what this is showing in these first 2 instances is that the data, that people are still heavily dedicated to negotiating and discussing race in terms of science, in terms of scientific race and genetic race, as well as modern conceptions of the nation states as markers of identity categorization. Language, on the other hand, took a backseat in the conversation, though I hypothesized that it would be more important. Co-naturalization of language and race only presented in 16 tokens, and accent ideology only came up 2 times. I will admit that accent ideology was put into the study because it appeared in a previous study about language and race and had more of it. So it didn't appear in this, this set, but it is something that does come up. I'm not going to give examples of the ideologies, but I welcome questions during question and answer to show exactly how the form of how they appeared in the data. But for now, across the data set, the mean scores for affect, alignment, and investment are presented for each of the racial-linguistic ideologies seen in this table. So the scores reflect a narrow window of variation between each racial-linguistic ideology, but it's important to note that the scores presented here do not indicate a neutrality, but rather a trend towards an equal number of individuals who were either totally not aligned with a score of 0 or 1, or those who were completely aligned with a score of 5. In fact, there were rarely times where there were explicit scores of 3 given, because most commenters had very strong feelings and opinions about what they were saying. Even though the co-naturalization of language and race was not as prevalent in the data as I hypothesized, commenters seem to be most invested when speaking about this ideology. So they have the highest score of investment when this ideology did come up. That is even higher than the 3.302 that we see with the DNA ideology. But when conversations did turn to the DNA conversation, commenters seem to be most in agreement that DNA was a valid marker for racial and sometimes ethnic differentiation. Averages were also taken across each ethno-racial identifier, or the self-identifications of the content producers, of the video producers. And I note that I removed the analysis of accent ideology due to its limited appearance across the data set. But investment scores for the co-naturalization of language and race show the ideology to be taken up very highly by everybody except for those who were participating with the Dominican videos. And so that only elicited a 2.12 level of investment. And when it was introduced by the Dominican content producers, it was mostly contested, eliciting a slight trend towards disagreement with a 2.77 score. In other words, when people brought up the co-naturalization of language and race, it was mostly to oppose its validity. So these scores indicate a lack of participation in the deployment of co-naturalization of language and race as a valid tool for the construction of racial identity and for the construction of racial boundaries. On the other hand, DNA ideology had strong alignment across the subject positionalities, with the highest score by Panamanians, who most often had self and ascribed like street race Blackness. And this embodied Blackness of physical features may be the reason why videos produced by Panamanians most often elicited strong engagement in conversations about DNA and scientific race, with this highest investment score of 3.74. With the exception of the video posted by the Cuban, most people tended to have positive feelings about DNA as a valid marker of racial difference. Lastly, the video produced by the Nigerian American elicited the most investment in categorization fallacy with the 3.94 score. But we see that the video produced by the Cuban received comments that were most aligned with the categorization ideology with the 3.33 score. So the people that were interacting with the Cuban most often agreed with the conflation of race, ethnicity, and nationality as one kind of topic, right? But what's most interesting regarding this ideology was the trend towards negative feelings about this ideology, with commenters often displaying kind of visceral responses to the introduction of ethnicity as race, or in some cases, the insistence on the difference between race and ethnicity. So these differences in investment versus alignment scores indicate that there may be a difference in national conceptualizations of boundaries of difference that are in play in these digital spaces that kind of transcend these national bounds. A fruitful example of the way that these boundaries of difference were created was found through an exploration of moments of conflict and solidarity. And so 3 codes were developed in order to explore these moments: anti-Blackness, interethnic conflict, and interethnic solidarity. So anti-Blackness referred to moments where there was a combined use of the N-word, the derogatory word, with comments against Black identity categorizations. So this comment reads, "I've never seen a Dominican as Black or blacker than Godfrey. This N-word burnt. Y'all got us confused with Haitians. The darkest we go is Will Smith's color," end quote. The fact that the comparison of mixedness or Dominicanidad is alongside the use of a famous African American is ironic, to say the least. Interethnic conflicts, on the other hand, were characterized by explicit mention of disagreement between individuals regarding identification practices. So this comment reads, quote, "Parts of our culture come from West Africa, nothing to do with American Blacks. But American Blacks themselves, yes, they envy us, Dominicans, because of our mixed heritage," end quote. Here we see a mention of mixed race as a boundary-making element between African Americans and Dominicans, which alludes both to scientific race and to categorization fallacy. Lastly, interethnic solidarities were characterized by explicit moments of racial accord or bringing together of different ethnic positionalities from different Black subjectivities. So in this comment, the commenter reads, quote, "She never said that she wasn't Black, and being that this ignorant A comment got pinned disgust me. You do know that the freeways from West Africa came over to the Caribbean and Latin America first, right? Before the slave trade. How can Black people be so ignorant to Black history? Latina is a culture, not a damn race," end quote. So this commenter is explicitly breaking the category fallacy in order to show that there are racial solidarities between those who may come from different ethnic groups, but who have African descendants. So while the constructions of Blackness continues to rely on these colonial logics of scientific race taken up in DNA ideologies, the mobilization of national borders and language allowed for novel racializations of Latinidad that marked it as distinct from Blackness. But the use of language as a distinguishing feature of Latinidad seems to be part of a larger project of Latinidad that's not necessarily taken up by Dominicans themselves, who often recognize that you can both fit into the scientific racial logics of Blackness while possessing the cultural norms that are being marked as mutually exclusive. Although many Latinxes transcend the boundaries of Blackness and Latinidad, Blackness has been a defining characteristic of US social order that links individuals to notions of poverty, violence, ignorance, and laziness. So it's no surprise that for some Dominican Americans, a negotiation and possible distancing from Blackness may be employed in the performance of a racial identity. So looking at this particular data from an anti-racist stance, we must ask what questions of social justice and liberation, like what happens when you fight for the visibilization of African descended people without disrupting these colonial logics under which we were socialized, so disrupting these scientific logics of race. So in this paper, anti-Black stereotypes were most often attributed to African Americans, and for immigrants and their immediate descendants in the United States, Blackness is often conflated with an ethnic identity of African Americans. So this leaves people who are not, who have families that are from different places in the diaspora in a precarious pace of identity construction. And lastly, those who have limited ability to negotiate Blackness through language or culture because of physical characteristics such as skin color or hair texture were often the ones that engaged in acts of policing Blackness, calling on notions of hypodescent, while also questioning authenticity based on linguistic and cultural practices. So this policing of Blackness is a direct reformulation of these colonial structures of power. And solidarity seems to be born from discursive ruptures in these ideologies, in these narratives, in these colonial formations of powers that have shaped the racial logics of the United States and the Dominican Republic. And so thinking about solidarity as a way to disrupt colonial logics of power is one thing that I'm going to consider in future studies. So thank you all for coming. I want to give a special shout out to my former students from Brooklyn and the Bronx, especially Eric Matos and Chris Pena, who are always willing to have conversations with me about Dominicanidad, about language, and about diasporic solidarities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Iris. Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. And any questions, please, or any comments? Yes, we have some comments in our chat, and thank you, Iris, such important work. What a wonderful talk. So many positive and interesting comments. Thank you, Iris. Great talk. Iris, you're so popular. Wow, your talk is wow. And was it difficult to prepare your results? What was the how difficult was to ask audience about these problems?
Sorry, excuse me.
Sorry.
So I didn't, most of the data was taken from the internet. So these comments were coming from people who were commenting on YouTube videos. So all of the comments, I don't really have information about who the people were who were engaging in the conversations besides explicit mention. I'm from the Dominican Republic, or I'm African American, and this is what I believe. Though it's the internet, so we can't necessarily trust those comments. So these are overall opinions about how people are engaging with this, regardless of what their subject positionalities are.
Okay, thank you. And we have some questions in our box. The first one, do you see them, Iris? Do you see this question? I know you mentioned at the end of some of your future research. What else do you have to mind for this project? The first one.
Yeah, so I'm interested in seeing the differences in the ways that people who fit at the intersections of these categorizations, so people who exist at the intersection of Blackness and Latinidad, what terms are they actually using to describe themselves? And then how are people interacting with those terms, right? And so a lot of times when people are telling us that, hey, I can be both Black and Latino, then people in other populations, other ethnic populations that also exhibit or also fit into Black subjectivities are either ratifying or not allowing people to have those kinds of pronouncements about themselves. And I'm seeing what that does for the overall understanding or the overall project of Latinidad in the United States, right? And so in future work, what I'm really interested in looking at is these moments of racial pronouncements that, for example, if we think of like a Rachel Dolezal, or we think of all of these kind of recent news stories of people that say, oh, this person has been pretending to be a Latino for all of this time, but actually they're white, as if you can't be white and Latino at the same time, or as if you can't be, the centering of Latinidad is a white centering station. So I'm looking at people who live at the margins of these and how they are actually categorizing themselves and using language in unique ways to disrupt colonial logics of boundaries around ethno-racial identities.
Thank you. And two other questions. The first one, tell us about the development of your framework. Why these three things and why? How did you originally start?
Yeah, so I wanted to be able to, so the framework started with just a critical discourse analysis, using some of the ideologies that I had read about and had thought about in different ways. And also in these conversations that I was telling you that I was having with my students, my former students in Brooklyn and the Bronx, who were always having arguments amongst themselves about their identities. And so this study started with a pilot study, just asking Dominican American youth what identity terms they used, and doing a comparison between Dominican youth in New York City and Dominican youth in Madrid. And some of those people who participated in the study were actual family members, but those in the United States had 100% discord between those in Spain on the actual terms that they were using. So Dominicans in Spain often called themselves Afroamericanos or African Americans because they said that the Dominican Republic was in the Americas and they were Afro descendants. Whereas in the United States, of course, Dominicans were not calling themselves that. So I wanted to see what kind of ideologies were impacting the stances that people were taking towards these terms. And so that is why I ended up taking up first the critical discourse analysis and then this critical stance taking analysis. But I also think that it's important when I'm thinking about Blackness to integrate critical race studies and to integrate Black studies. In particular, because they've thought about these questions in a way that linguists haven't. And so I wanted to incorporate the frames that critical Black scholars have been thinking about and thinking about identities since the Black Atlantic, since the crossing of the Atlantic. So that was how it.
Thank you, Iris. And I think the last question from Salvatore Silsana. And hi, Iris, thank you so much for this. I know some of your other work is related to educational contexts. So do you see any commentary in these videos or in these comments about rationality?
Yeah,
experience in schools?
Thank you for that question. And you know I was looking for this answer. Most of the comments about school came up with the categorization fallacy ideology, and that was because it became quite apparent that people had notions about nation state and about ethnicity and about race that were formed under lessons of what it meant to be an American, what it meant to be from a particular ethnic group, that they said, well, like, didn't you take a history class that taught you about X and X experience? Or like you saw in that comment that I showed about the girl saying, don't you know that the roads of Africans slave trade passed through Latin America and the Caribbean before slavery here? And so they talked about education in order to tell people about their lack of education from having different opinions about what racial boundaries happened. And so we can also see that there is an interesting moment happening with history being employed as a way to create boundaries as well, and history that's being taught in particular context being different, right? And so I also saw people saying, well, what I learned when I went to school in the Dominican Republic is different from what I learned when I went to school in the United States. So these things are being influenced by people's educational experiences.
Thank you, Iris. And we have only 2 minutes, but I see that there are no comments and there are no any other questions. So thank you very much. And let's turn to our next presentation. Mary C. Levissier.
I'm just going to share my screen. Everyone can see the PowerPoint now. So I'm going to speak about genre, so the way that it is not only something that is standardized and fixed, but also the way that it can vary. So I'd like to start, however, by situating this research in a larger research project. So that is about maritime shipping and maritime shipping alliances. And just to give some background about this domain, 80% of global trade volume actually goes by sea, and the majority of merchandise goods, so everything that's probably around you, wherever you are, was probably at one time transported by sea and by container. And so these containers are often transported by what are now known as alliances, which are groups of different shipping lines that work together because the market is such, the sector is such a competitive sector that they usually work together. And actually 80% of container trade is done by 3 alliances. So that you have on the slide, 2M, Ocean Alliance, and the Alliance. And the legal instruments that are used to create these alliances are called cooperative working agreements in part. And so this is what we're going to be looking at with this linguistic study about standardization and variability. So just to quickly give you an outline of this talk, so I'm going to speak quickly about the literature on standardization, variability, and cooperative working agreements, look at our research questions, our method, and our corpus, some results, and then finish up with a discussion and some conclusions. So legal genres, when we think about legal language and legal genres, probably what comes to mind is a very fixed, sort of archaic language that is very standardized and formulaic. And so, yes, it's true that some of the literature talks about, genres being, and legal genres being, so these cognitive structuring practices, so they're conventionalized and they're standardized organization used by almost all the members of a professional community, which is what Batya talked about in 1993. And we know that this is true of all professional genres, but legal genres particularly face extra pressure because they need to become and remain compliant with law. And we also know that within this community of speakers, because genres are a tool for a community of speakers, lawyers tend to be trained to avoid unnecessary risks and any kind of conscious linguistic change, the choice to say something differently than what is traditionally used as an expression, as a genre, is going to involve risk. So that's going to be avoided. However, in the literature, we also see that legal language and legal genres are subject to variability. So legal language has different types of legal language. The language that's used in statutes is not the same language that you're going to find in contracts, for example. Legal genres are dynamic because a genre is an instrument. When the community is faced with some kind of new problem, the genre has to adapt to that problem. So they are also subject to variation. And especially interesting is this idea that genres are not only a constraining activity or practice, they are also something that can enable individuals, so that they're going to enable individuals to do things that are perhaps a little bit questionable, but since they are wrapped in socially or legally legitimate language, then this is going to be possible. And this is really where we wanted to situate this question, because alliances have, caused lately a lot of criticism because they allow companies to work together in a way that might violate competition law, even though, as we'll see, the maritime shipping industry is not subject always to the same competition law, but even then. And so this is where we wanted to look at this one type of genre. So not a lot of research has been done about how can one genre allow a certain amount of variability, and that variability can be exploited. So that's what we wanted to look at here. Just to quickly, before we move on to the results, look at the cooperative working agreements and the liner shipping industry. So as I was saying, liner shipping in certain jurisdictions, for example, in the United States, has a derogatory regime concerning competition law. So where we're going to be very strict about antitrust and about not having cartels that can agree on one price and then put pressure on consumers, the liner shipping industry is going to have an exemption for that in the United States and in other places. The sector is highly globalized. Obviously, if you're trying to ship things around the world, it's going to be globalized, and it's also very standardized in speaking about industry. However, in terms of law and rules, it's not globally harmonized. So in the United States, liners can agree on rates, whereas in Europe, that is not legal, and in China, it's even stricter. So there is, as we saw, a trend towards cooperation between liners through things like cooperative working agreements, and this is something that gives them commercial and technical advantages. Before, we had what were called conferences, which are now no longer legal in Europe, so we've moved to consortia and alliances. these sorts of cooperative endeavors basically mutualize and rationalize production means while minimizing risks at the same time. And so here are just two important dates to remember. So in 2008, conferences were made illegal or prohibited in the European Union. And then in 2014, the Chinese Competition Authority judged that the P3 alliance, which linked three, which was an alliance, an agreement that was signed by three of the major liners, was actually a de facto joint venture and was therefore in violation of competition law. However, cooperative working agreements are private contracts, so they're not generally made public. And so for this reason, there are very few studies about them, either from a legal perspective or from a linguistic perspective. So another thing that was interesting for us when we decided to do the study. And our research questions were therefore, for the first one, do cooperative working agreements show standardization or variability in their linguistic macrostructure and their content? And second, are there any trends in the variation? For our method and corpus, so we used 46 cooperative working agreements that had been approved by and published by the United States Federal Maritime Commission. It was a small corpus, around 88,140 words. We only chose original agreements, so no republications. In American law, anytime you change anything in an agreement, even just one of the partners, you have to republish the agreement and get the agreement reapproved. So we didn't want to include republications that could introduce a bias if one agreement had 20 republications, for example, and another only had 2 or 3. The dates, so the agreements in our corpus date from 1985 to 2020. And to prepare the corpus, we manually converted the PDF files into text files, and we coded for certain variables, the most important of which for this presentation and this article are date and the second classification of the document, because the agreements can be and are, as we'll see, classified sometimes secondarily as other types of agreements. We then did a qualitative macrostructure analysis of titles, secondary classifications, and the articles within the agreements. And we used a textometric software that's called Hierarchical. It's a French textometric software that we used for content analysis. So here are some of our results in terms of our analysis of the titles and the classification. So on the slide here, you can see on the left an example of an original title page for this agreement that is called the Entitled World Shipping Council Agreement. And below it, you can see that it's classified as a cooperative working agreement. However, on the left, you can see that there's a certain amount of variability in the titles. Titles of contracts are supposed to give legally are obliged to give some information about the contents of the contract. However, you can see there are some titles that are very vague. For example, Digital Container Shipping Association Agreement. What does that actually mean? Well, if you read the agreement, which is one of the longer agreements, it actually means that it's a creation of a platform that these liners can use to share information. So, but it's not very clear from the title, whereas other titles can be much more specific, as the last three in the examples I give. So we have, but what's interesting about these last three is that not only are they very technical, but they also sort of secondarily class these agreements as space charter agreements, as joint operating agreements, or as vessel sharing agreements. So we see there's some variation in these titles in terms of actually reclassifying the cooperative working agreement. We also used this information to do a second classification of the cooperative working agreements. So we can see a breakdown of the secondary classifications. So one was an alliance, you have some other ones. Either this was done by the agreement itself, for example, with the title, or it was done by the Federal Maritime Commission, which secondarily classed these agreements. In terms of length and the number of articles, we also observed a certain amount of variation. So we can see that there is a slight trend towards becoming shorter in terms of words by date in figure 1, but there's a lot of variation there. And in terms of articles per working agreement as compared to date, we can see that there's a lot of variation as well. So basically, we have about an average of 11 articles per cooperative working agreement, but that can vary rather widely, as we have some, for example, that have 19. We also looked at what were the themes of the articles. So in general, this was the title of the articles within the working agreements, but sometimes we classified it more generally when we coded the corpus as a theme, because that allowed us, for example, to combine two articles that were similar. For example, if the article is entitled membership and then membership and exclusion, then we put both of them in membership. And as you can see, certain articles reappear in almost all of these agreements. So name, purpose, parties, geographic scope is going to be talking about the different ports of call, the different port rotation schedule, and how quickly these different vessels need to transport their goods within the agreement. However, the most interesting article was the overview of agreement authority, because it was such a vast, it included such a vast different numbers of contents. It could be very long or very short. I don't have time to talk about all of that, but basically where you would think the purpose would explain what the agreement was really about, actually you really find that in the overview of agreement authority article. And so you can see also what is interesting about these agreements is that they are very exclusive. So in the membership articles, often it's stipulated that, so this company is going to share a certain amount of space on its vessels with this other company, but that first company can, and the two companies cannot share with anyone else without the members agreeing. So it's a very exclusive relationship. And also the last thing that's interesting is that most of the dispute resolution is going to happen outside of the legal system in a private arbitration system. So you have here on slide 11 also some different articles that were less common. Some of them, the interesting articles being, for example, separate identity. So separate identity being the companies trying to comply, or at least in form, comply with the idea that it couldn't be a merger, it's not a merger. We have actually separate legal identities and we're not sharing marketing information, which of course is questionable given all the other information that's being shared. I'm going to now move on to the results of our content analysis. So this is on this slide, you can see our similarity analysis, which is basically based on graph theory, and you're going to be seeing words that are closely linked in space. So the most common collocations, for example, and it's not surprising that we see these words sort of grouped around, on one hand, agreement, and on the other hand, party. What is more interesting is how these words act in time. So I've created from another graph that I didn't find very visually easy to understand. On the right, you can see sort of how these different words are linked in time to, or are significantly linked in time to these different, to either agreement or party. And what we see in time is that the words get much more technical. So for example, at the beginning of what words were linked with party, you have, for example, notice, right, decision, request day, vote. These could be in any kind of agreement that's not necessarily in the maritime shipping industry. But as you go down in time, especially starting from around 2014, which was the famous Chinese competition law decision, you can see that the words become much more technical. And that's the same, although less maybe clearly, but the words also attached to agreement become legally a bit more specific to legal language. However, and we can see on the sides of these two words, so on one side discuss, on the other side effect and purpose, these words are not linked specifically to any time, so they remain constant. That discussion is one of the most important things to link what's going on between the parties. In terms of what we call the descending hierarchical classification, which is an algorithm that creates clusters from the corpus, basically is going to use the chi-square test to create statistically significant clusters. We can see that we had 4 that came up. So interestingly enough, the business network, which is cluster number 3, sort of the light blue on the slide, is the largest. Takes up the most amount of the corpus, whereas these are supposed to be, right, just technical agreements about how to share ships or how to share space on ships. Business framework is taking up a lot of the corpus, followed by, again, it's interesting, strategic exchanges, whereas technically these are supposed to be technical exchanges, which is class 1, and is actually the second to smallest class. So you have legal framework, which is the smallest class. So in the other figures, you have these classes linked, showing how they behave and interact with the variables. In figure 6, it's going to be the secondary classification, and in figure 7, time. So in figure 6, you can see that, for example, technical exchanges is very highly correlated with the slot changing, the slot charter agreements, and very negatively disassociated then with the business framework class. And that's going to be the opposite for the business framework, which is going to be, it's very negatively associated with the cooperative working agreements that have no secondary classification. And in business framework, so as a class, going to be highly correlated with the cooperative working agreements that have no secondary classification. And we can see in time also, and this sort of confirms what we saw in the similarity analysis, is that the more recent agreements are going to be more highly correlated, more strongly correlated with a very technical, the technical class, which is class 1 technical exchanges, and whereas the older agreements are going to be more strongly correlated with business framework. So again, this is possibly the companies reacting to the decision made by the Chinese competition authority about needing to not look like joint ventures. So just to have some discussion and conclusion of our results. So to come back to our research questions, so do cooperative working agreements show standardization or variation in their linguistic macrostructure and context? Well, they do show some of both. We see a core set of standardized articles, these themes that come up generally, so name, purpose, parties. But however, we see a lot of variation as well. Are there any trends in this variation? Well, we did seem to see a trend concerning secondary classification and in time. So when the cooperative working agreements had no secondary classification, they tended to show be more highly correlated with the business framework class. When they were classified secondarily as vessel sharing agreements or slot charter agreements. So vessel sharing agreements being where the companies are going to share these large container vessels, and slot charter agreements being where they're going to actually reserve space for containers, for each other's containers. These are very highly correlated with technical exchanges. However, what we see is that the technical language, is more associated with more recent cooperative working agreements, but there is sort of this constant use of the word discuss. So in time, it's not correlated with any specific time or any specific type of agreement, secondarily classed. And our interpretation is that all the cooperative working agreements in the corpus are concerned with discussion. So this is one of the things that is important, this exchange of information, which is also questionable from a point of view of competition law in certain jurisdictions, and strategic exchanges. So yes, there are technical exchanges, but what is also happening is this focus on strategic changes. So to come back to this question of standardization versus variability, so certain legal genres may allow some strategic endeavors to maintain legitimacy, so questionable strategic endeavors, through their variability. So the fact that these genres can vary allow companies the room to maneuver, but to remain within the law. And then the level of standardization or variability of a specific legal genre really depends on the actors and the community's objectives. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to take any questions that you
Thank you, Mary.
have.
Thank you. And questions or comments, please. We have no questions and no comments. Well, thank you, Mary. Positive comments. And maybe any questions about so interesting theme? Genre is very important in our life. No questions. Mary, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for this interesting session. And it was my pleasure to be a chair of this session. Thank you again. And I want to see you, and I want to wish you health and useful conference also.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aris.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
See
you.
you. See you. Thank you. Thank you all.